There is a moment in every person's life when they realize that the institution they work for, the principles they claim to stand by, and the actual choices they make have stopped being the same thing. For most people, that moment comes and goes quietly. They notice the contradiction. They feel uncomfortable. And then they move on. For one researcher in San Francisco, that moment became public policy. His name is Christopher Olah. He is not famous. He did not build a social media empire or pioneer consumer technology. He is not the billionaire face of his company. He is, by the standards of Silicon Valley, relatively anonymous. A machine learning researcher who co-founded a company called Anthropic with a premise that most of the technology industry found either naive or threatening, depending on who you asked. The premise was simple: the people building the most powerful artificial intelligence systems in human history have a moral obligation to understand those systems before they deploy them. That premise would eventually lead to one of the most unusual invitations ever sent by the Vatican. An invitation that would expose a fundamental contradiction in how the world's most powerful institutions, military, corporate, and religious, think about power, ethics, and the future. But the story does not begin with the Vatican. It begins with a military. In early 2025, as artificial intelligence capabilities accelerated beyond what most experts had predicted, the United States Department of Defense began making the rounds through Silicon Valley. The message was clear and consistent. The military needed access to the most advanced AI models. It needed them integrated into weapons systems, intelligence platforms, and autonomous decision-making tools. It was willing to pay substantially, and it expected cooperation. Most companies cooperated. Some eagerly. Some quietly. Some with internal protests that management quickly contained by reminding employees that Pentagon contracts were worth more than petitions. Anthropic refused. The company's leadership made a decision that would have consequences they could not fully anticipate. They refused to modify their AI safety systems to accommodate military applications. They refused to build custom tools for autonomous targeting. They refused to weaken the guardrails that they had spent years designing to prevent their technology from being weaponized without meaningful human oversight. The Pentagon's response was swift and unprecedented. Anthropic was classified as a supply chain risk, a designation normally reserved for foreign companies suspected of connections to hostile governments. It was the first time in American history that such a classification had been applied to a domestic technology company for refusing to cooperate with the military. The practical consequences were immediate. Federal contracts disappeared. Security clearances became complicated. A chill ran through Silicon Valley, signaling that saying no to the Department of Defense carried a real cost. Anthropic absorbed the blow and continued operating. But something fundamental had shifted. The company was no longer just a startup building safe artificial intelligence. It was a company that had been officially designated as a risk by its own government for refusing to build dangerous artificial intelligence. That distinction, that gap between what the company built and what it refused to build, would eventually catch the attention of the highest levels of the Catholic Church. It started in the fall of 2025, during the early planning stages of what would become the Pope's first major encyclical. Pope Leo XIII had assembled a small team of advisors to shape the document. A theologian from the Pontifical Academy for Life. A Jesuit ethicist. A lay Catholic scientist who had spent 2 decades in machine learning before leaving the industry to teach at a pontifical university. A canon lawyer familiar with navigating religious doctrine through contemporary crises. They met weekly in the Pope's private study. Usually Thursday evenings. Usually for 2 or 3 hours. During one of these sessions, the lay scientist presented a comprehensive overview of the major artificial intelligence companies. She discussed their public positions on safety, their approaches to regulation, their stated ethical frameworks. And when she reached Anthropic, she paused. She told the Pope that Anthropic was the only major AI company that had publicly refused to remove safety restrictions for military applications. She told him that the Pentagon had approached the company and Anthropic had declined. She told him that as a direct result, the company had been classified as a supply chain risk. The Pope asked her to repeat that last point. She did. There was a long silence. Then the Pope said something that would shape the entire direction of the encyclical. A company that builds the most advanced artificial intelligence in the world refused to allow it to be used for killing people. And for that choice, its own government branded it a threat. He paused. That is precisely the kind of insanity this document needs to address. From that moment, Anthropic became woven into the intellectual DNA of the encyclical that would eventually be titled Magnifica Humanitas, the magnificence of humanity. Not as a corporate endorsement. Not as an endorsement of any kind. But as a case study. A real-world example of what happens when a technology company places moral limits before corporate interests and market pressures. The encyclical itself does not name Anthropic. Papal encyclicals never name corporations. But the section addressing autonomous weapons contains language unmistakably shaped by the Anthropic decision. It speaks of institutions that have chosen conscience over contract and voices within the technological sphere that have refused to surrender the human person to the logic of machinery. In a paragraph that Vatican insiders believe was drafted personally by the Pope, Magnifica Humanitas states this: when a creator of powerful instruments exercises restraint over profit, such restraint is not weakness. It is the exercise of moral imagination that the architects of war have forgotten. That paragraph was why the invitation was sent to San Francisco. But the decision to send that invitation to Christopher Olah personally, to ask him to stand beside the Pope at the official presentation of the encyclical, created an immediate crisis inside the Vatican. The objections came from three directions simultaneously. The Secretariat of State objected on diplomatic grounds. Inviting the co-founder of a company the Pentagon had designated as a supply chain risk to stand beside the Pope at a major Vatican event would be interpreted, correctly, as a direct challenge to the United States government. Relationships between Rome and Washington were already strained. The Pope's recent comments about delusions of omnipotence fueling regional conflicts had already provoked a hostile response from Washington. Adding this provocation would, in the words of one diplomat, pour gasoline on a fire we are still working to contain. The Dicastery for Communication objected on purely optical grounds. Vatican officials were concerned that presenting an encyclical alongside a technology company executive, any technology company executive, would create the appearance of corporate alignment. Critics would argue that the encyclical was not a theological document but a marketing exercise. The moral authority of the text would be diluted. The third objection came from a cardinal who had known the Pope since their years together in Peru and who felt comfortable speaking frankly. He told the Pope in private that the invitation was the kind of gesture that creates enemies in places where you cannot afford enemies. He said, "You are asking a man who builds artificial intelligence to help you present a document questioning the moral foundations of artificial intelligence itself. The contradictions alone will consume the entire conversation. Nobody will discuss the encyclical. Everyone will talk about why he was there." The Pope listened to all three objections carefully. He requested a detailed diplomatic assessment from the Secretariat of State. He read it thoroughly. He considered the practical consequences. And then he sent the invitation anyway. When his secretary asked why he had overruled the objections, the Pope explained his reasoning in words that have since circulated through every office in the Vatican. "If I present this encyclical surrounded only by cardinals and theologians, the world sees an old institution lecturing about a technology it does not understand. If I present it alongside a man who builds that technology, a man who has paid a real price for choosing ethics over obedience to power, the world sees something completely different. It sees that this is not theory. It is not abstraction. It is a genuine conversation between faith and science that both sides are willing to have." He added, "The Church has spent centuries being afraid of science. I intend to end that in one afternoon." But what happened next revealed just how high the stakes had truly become. The news broke on May 18, Bloomberg reported it first. Within hours, PBS, the National Catholic Reporter, and The Hill had confirmed the story. The headline was everywhere: the Pope would present his first encyclical alongside the co-founder of Anthropic, the AI company that had defied the Pentagon. The reaction was immediate and split exactly as the Curia had predicted. In Washington, the response was hostile. A senior State Department official told a Catholic news outlet, off the record, that the Vatican's decision to platform a company designated as a supply chain risk was deeply unhelpful and could further damage an already difficult bilateral relationship. A congressional aide working on defense appropriations was more direct: the Pope just sided with a company that told the Department of Defense no. That is not going to be forgotten. A source inside the White House told a technology publication that the president had been briefed on the event. The president had called it a problem. No further explanation was provided. But the fact that a papal encyclical presentation required a presidential briefing told its own story about the seriousness with which Washington was taking the event. In Silicon Valley, the reaction was more complicated. Some technology leaders praised the move as a signal that ethical AI development had powerful institutional backing outside the industry itself. Others were uncomfortable with the religious framing, worried that papal endorsement, even if implicit, would create expectations about moral limits that the industry was not prepared to accept. At Anthropic itself, the decision to accept the invitation was not automatic. Internal discussions lasted 2 days. Board members raised concerns about the optics of a technology company appearing to seek validation from religious authority. Lawyers warned that the supply chain risk designation could be escalated if Anthropic was perceived as actively undermining U.S. defense policy. One advisor suggested sending a lower-level representative instead, someone junior enough that the symbolic weight would be less significant. Christopher Olah refused. He told the board, "If we send someone junior, we send a message that we believe in safety only when it is convenient. The Pope is not asking us to make a political statement. He is asking us to stand behind what we have already claimed to believe. If we cannot do that on a public stage, we never actually believed it in the first place." The board voted to proceed with Olah's attendance. The vote was not unanimous, but it was decisive. The event was scheduled for May 25, just over a week away. Inside the Vatican, preparations intensified immediately. The presentation would take place in the Synod Hall, a modern auditorium adjacent to St. Peter's Basilica, with capacity for over 300 people. The guest list would include cardinals, bishops, ambassadors, journalists, scientists, representatives from technology companies and international organizations. Simultaneous translation would be provided in 12 languages. The Pope had personally designed the format himself. He would open with a 20-minute address presenting the core arguments of the encyclical. Then Olah would speak for 15 minutes about the practical realities of AI development, the pressures companies face, the moral choices they make, the political costs of choosing ethics. A theologian would provide doctrinal context. Then audience questions. The Pope had insisted on the questions. The Secretariat of State had recommended a closed format, speeches only, no interaction, controlled messaging. It was safer. It was predictable. It was what every previous pope would have chosen. Leo XIII refused. He said, "If this document cannot survive questions from the people it addresses, it does not deserve to be published." When the Secretariat pressed, noting that hostile questions from journalists could derail the message, the Pope replied with a statement his staff has repeated with a mixture of admiration and alarm. "I would rather be challenged in public than praised in private. The Church has had enough of private praise. It has made us comfortable, and it has made us irrelevant. On May 25, we will be neither." The Pope had also personally expanded the guest list. The Vatican initially proposed 200 seats. He expanded it to 350. He added categories of invitees that the Secretariat had not included. Graduate students in computer science from 3 Roman universities. representatives from digital rights organizations. In a move that raised eyebrows throughout the Curia, executives from competing AI companies who had taken public positions against autonomous weapons. A curial official involved in the logistics described the guest list as deliberately designed to create productive discomfort. He said, "The Pope does not want a room full of people who will applaud. He wants a room of people who will argue. He believes Magnifica Humanitas is strong enough to survive the argument, and he believes the argument itself, public and visible and uncomfortable, is part of the actual teaching." Security arrangements for the event were unprecedented. The combination of a papal encyclical launch, the presence of a high-profile American technology executive already caught in political controversy, and subject matter directly challenging the military policies of multiple major governments created a threat profile that Vatican security classified at the highest level. The U.S. Embassy confirmed attendance at the ambassadorial level. Vatican observers interpreted this as a signal that Washington intended to be visibly present when the encyclical was launched. What they would hear would be a document challenging the moral foundations of their government's approach to artificial intelligence, warfare, and surveillance. Meanwhile, the final text of Magnifica Humanitas had been locked. No more revisions. No more edits. Translations into 32 languages were complete. The printed copies, bound in the traditional cream-colored covers used for papal encyclicals, were being prepared by the Vatican publishing house. A Monsignor involved in the production described holding one of the advance copies. He said, "It is heavier than I expected. Not physically, but theologically. Every sentence carries weight. Every paragraph makes a claim that someone will fight. I have worked on papal documents for 15 years. I have never held one that felt like this." He paused. "It feels like a weapon. A weapon made of words. And the Pope is about to hand it to the world." There was one more element of the May 25 event that had received almost no public attention but that inside the Vatican had generated more discussion than any other detail. The Pope had requested that the event conclude with a joint statement. Not a Vatican statement. Not a papal declaration. A joint statement co-signed by Pope Leo XIV and Christopher Olah committing both the Catholic Church and Anthropic to a set of shared principles on the ethical development and deployment of artificial intelligence. The statement was being drafted by a small team including representatives from both institutions. The Vatican side was led by the Pope's personal theologian. The Anthropic side was being coordinated by Olah himself. The two teams had been in daily communication for the past week, working through language that must satisfy both the theological requirements of papal magisterium and the practical commitments of a technology company operating under intense political pressure. A source familiar with the drafting process described it as the most unusual document ever attempted. He said, "You have canon lawyers and machine learning researchers in the same conversation trying to find words that work for both worlds. It is extraordinary. It is also, I think, exactly what the Pope intended. He wanted to prove that these two worlds can speak to each other. The statement is the proof. If the joint statement was signed, if the language was finalized, if political pressures did not force one side to withdraw, it would be the first time in history that a Pope had co-signed a public document with a technology company executive. The precedent would be staggering. The Pope knew this. He had said privately to his secretary, "They will criticize me for this for years. Good. Let them criticize me while the principles are being followed. I would rather be criticized for acting than praised for waiting." In the days immediately preceding May 25, Pope Leo XIII had been unusually quiet. No interviews. No public statements beyond what the press office had released. No discussions with journalists, diplomats, or even most members of his own curia. But those closest to him described a man who was deeply focused and entirely at peace with what was about to happen. His personal secretary, Monsignor Andres, told a colleague, "He has been rereading the encyclical every night. Not editing it. Just reading it. Like a man rereading a letter he has written to someone he loves, making sure every word says exactly what he means. A member of the papal household said, "He told me something last night that I have not been able to stop thinking about." He said, "On May 25th, the Church will say something about this century that no one else is willing to say. And the fact that a young man from Canada who builds machines will stand beside me when I say it, that is not a contradiction. That is the point." 5 days. 5 days until the Pope stands in the Synod Hall with a document that declares autonomous weapons intrinsically disordered, mass surveillance incompatible with human freedom, and the reduction of human beings to data points a violation of the image of God. 5 days until Christopher Olah stands beside him and tells the world what it costs, in real terms, in real money, in real political consequences, to build technology that respects the moral limits the Pope is about to declare. 5 days until every government, every corporation, every military, and every Catholic on earth has to reckon with a document that refuses to separate morality from machinery. Inside Anthropic's headquarters in San Francisco, Olah is preparing a speech. He is thinking about what words will convey the weight of the choice his company made. How to explain to an audience of cardinals, ambassadors, and journalists why refusing a military contract was not an act of defiance but an act of fidelity. Inside the Apostolic Palace in Rome, the Pope is rereading the encyclical one more time. Not to change it. To remember why he wrote it. Because on May 25th, the words become public. And once they are public, they cannot be retracted. They cannot be softened. They cannot be managed or explained away. They will exist in 32 languages. In every parish, every seminary, every government office, every corporate boardroom on earth. And they will ask a question that no algorithm can answer. What kind of world do you want to build? A world where machines that can think faster than humans make decisions about who lives and who dies? Where algorithms profile populations and determine who deserves opportunity? Where the capacity to build something automatically justifies building it? Or a world where power is constrained by wisdom? Where capability is limited by conscience? Where the most important thing a person or institution can do is not what they create, but what they choose not to create? The invitation was hand-delivered to San Francisco. The answer came back, yes. And on May 25th, 2 men from 2 different worlds will stand side by side and say, together, what neither the Church nor the technology industry has been willing to say alone. That there are lines that must not be crossed. Lines that exist not because they are convenient or profitable, not because governments or shareholders demand it, but because crossing them would diminish something essential about what it means to be human. That intelligence without conscience is not progress. It is a more efficient form of destruction. That the magnificence of humanity, the thing that separates the human person from every machine, every algorithm, every system ever built or ever to be built, is not what we create. It is what we choose not to create. It is the restraint that says, I could build this, but I will not. Because some powers are not meant to be exercised. Because some capabilities are not meant to exist. Because the measure of a civilization is not the strength of its tools, but the wisdom of its limits. The document is printed. The hall is ready. The seats are assigned. The translations are complete. The security is in place. The invitations have been sent and answered. The cameras are being tested. And in a room in San Francisco, a man who builds artificial intelligence is preparing a speech about why the most important thing his company ever did was refuse to build what the Pentagon asked it to build. And in Rome, a pope who was born in Chicago, who spent decades in the highlands of Peru learning that faith without action is silence, that pope is rereading his encyclical one final time. Remembering why he wrote it. Because on May 25th, the words become public. And once they are public, they cannot be taken back.